In the spring following one of the worst wildfire seasons Sonoma County had seen in over a decade, 46-year-old Adrienne Fournier paid $3,400 for 4 acres of scorched, blackened vineyard ground that the previous owner considered a total loss and couldn't sell fast enough. The Holloway family, who'd farmed the small hillside plot for 2 generations before fire swept through the ridge above their property the previous autumn, killing most of the vines outright and leaving the survivors stripped bare and charred, told Adrienne plainly that she was buying dead ground and a headache, and she was welcome to both. Adrienne had spent 19 years building a career as a sommelier and wine program director, first in Chicago and later at a well-regarded San Francisco restaurant. Before the restaurant's sudden closure the previous winter left her, at 46, with a deep, hard-won knowledge of wine and no clear professional home to put it in. Most of the Sonoma County wine community who heard about her purchase assumed she was either sentimentally overreaching in her grief over a lost career or simply hadn't understood what fire damage actually did to a vineyard's long-term viability. They weren't entirely wrong about the grief. They were wrong about almost everything else. By the second harvest after Adrienne bought that scorched hillside, 3 separate winemakers, including 2 with considerable regional reputations, were competing for access to fruit from vines everyone else had written off as destroyed, drawn by a mineral intensity and structural complexity in the grapes that none of them had encountered from any other vineyard in the appellation. If stories about second chances, patient expertise, and the surprising value hiding in what looks like total loss matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Adrienne's. Now let's find out what that burned hillside was really growing, and why winemakers would eventually fight over it. The fire that swept through the ridge above the Holloway family's small vineyard the previous October had moved fast and hot through drought-stressed brush before reaching the cultivated rows, killing most of the plot's younger vines outright while leaving a scattered stand of considerably older, deeply rooted head-trained vines, planted decades earlier by the Holloway family's grandfather, scorched and leafless but, crucially, still alive at the root, the kind of old, dry-farmed vine stock that carried enough stored reserves and root depth to survive a fire that would have killed younger, shallower-rooted plantings outright. Adrienne had spent her 19 years in the wine industry developing exactly the kind of technical sensory expertise that most casual observers, including most of the Sonoma wine community assessing the Holloway property that winter, simply didn't have reason to apply to a burned vineyard. A serious sommelier's training goes considerably beyond identifying flavors in a finished wine. It requires a working understanding of viticulture, soil chemistry, and the countless environmental factors that shape a grape's character before it ever reaches a winemaker's hands, knowledge Adrienne had built through years of vineyard visits, harvest seasons spent working alongside growers, and the kind of relentless technical study that separated a competent sommelier from an exceptional one. What caught Adrienne's attention about the Holloway property wasn't sentiment. It was a detail she'd noticed on a single walk-through that January, arranged mostly out of professional curiosity after a former colleague mentioned the family was giving up on the burned plot entirely. The old vine's root systems, she could tell from the vigorous new growth already pushing through scorched bark despite the fire having occurred only months earlier, had survived with remarkable resilience. And the soil beneath the burned canopy, dark with ash and visibly different in texture from the unburned ground at the property's edge, reminded her, in a way she couldn't fully articulate on that first visit, of specific volcanic and ash-enriched vineyard soils she'd studied and tasted wine from during 2 research trips to Sicily's Mount Etna years earlier, soils famous throughout the wine world for producing grapes with unusually intense mineral character and structural complexity, a direct result of the volcanic ash and mineral deposits those vineyard soils carried. She raised the comparison, tentatively, with a soil scientist she'd met years earlier through a wine industry conference, Dr. Leland Cho, who'd since moved into agricultural consulting work across Northern California's wine country. Dr. Cho was cautiously interested rather than dismissive, explaining that wildfire ash could indeed deposit meaningful quantities of potassium and other minerals into topsoil, altering a vineyard's soil chemistry in ways that, depending on the specific composition of what burned and the underlying geology, could plausibly influence subsequent harvests, though he was careful to note that the science remained considerably less studied and less certain than established volcanic soil viticulture, and that any effect would need to be verified through actual harvest data rather than assumed from comparison alone. Adrienne's own former colleagues in the wine industry were less measured in their skepticism when she mentioned the purchase that winter. Bettina Alvarez, a wine buyer Adrienne had worked alongside for nearly a decade in Chicago, told her directly over the phone that she was letting professional grief cloud her judgment, buying a burned vineyard because she missed having a wine program to run and needed a project, any project, to fill the space her career's sudden end had left behind. Adrienne didn't entirely disagree with the grief part of that assessment. She simply didn't think it made her wrong about the soil. She purchased the property that February, alongside the Halloway family's genuine relief at finally offloading ground they considered worthless, and spent that first spring doing careful, unglamorous restoration work rather than anything dramatic, clearing fire debris by hand around the surviving old vines, having Dr. Cho conduct formal soil testing across multiple sections of the property, and researching, with the same relentless technical thoroughness she'd once applied to building a restaurant wine list, exactly what pruning and care the surviving vines would need to recover their full productive capacity after fire stress. Her neighbor, Gus Pemberton, who farmed a considerably larger, unburned vineyard on the adjoining property and had known the Halloway family for decades, watched Adrienne's restoration work that spring with genuine bafflement. That fruit's not going to be worth anything even if the vines do come back, he told her over the fence line one April afternoon, explaining, not unkindly, that most Sonoma winemakers he knew treated any fire-adjacent vineyard with real caution, wary of smoke taint issues that had devastated grape quality across parts of California in recent fire-heavy vintages. Adrienne explained, patiently, that smoke taint specifically affected fruit that was on the vine and actively ripening during smoke exposure, an entirely different situation from vines that had been dormant or leafless during the fire itself and were now producing fresh growth the following season, fruit that had never been exposed to smoke at all. Gus admitted he hadn't considered the distinction, though he remained politely unconvinced that any of it would matter much either way. Dr. Cho's formal soil analysis that spring confirmed what Adrienne had suspected from her initial walkthrough: elevated potassium levels and a distinctive mineral profile across the burned sections of the property compared to unburned control samples from the property's edge. A chemical signature genuinely comparable, in several key measures, to volcanic ash-influenced soils elsewhere in the world known for producing structurally distinctive wine grapes. The real test, as both Adrienne and Dr. Cho agreed, could only come from an actual harvest and finished wine, not soil chemistry alone. Adrienne spent that summer nursing the recovering old vines through their first full post-fire growing season, working with a part-time vineyard hand and consulting regularly with Dr. Cho on canopy management and irrigation, determined to give the surviving vines every reasonable advantage as they rebuilt their productive capacity after fire stress. The first meaningful harvest came that September, a modest yield given the vine's recovery status, but fruit that Adrienne, tasting individual grapes in the field with the same trained palate she'd once used to evaluate wine for a professional restaurant list, found genuinely remarkable, an intensity of flavor and a distinctive mineral, almost saline quality she recognized immediately from her memory of Etna wines years earlier. She sent samples that autumn to two winemakers she'd built relationships with during her restaurant career, both known for working with distinctive, terroir-driven fruit rather than conventional commercial grape sourcing. Marisol Delgado, a small production winemaker whose wines Adrienne had championed for years on restaurant lists, tasted the fruit and, according to her own later account, called Adrienne back within 2 days asking whether she could secure exclusive access to the following year's full harvest. Word moved through Sonoma County's tightly connected wine community quickly once Marisol's own enthusiasm became apparent at a regional winemakers gathering that winter. Within a month, 2 additional winemakers, including one with a considerably larger, well-established regional reputation, had reached out directly to Adrienne, both describing, independently, the same unusual mineral intensity and structural complexity Marisol had identified, and both interested in securing at least a portion of future harvests for themselves. Gus Pemberton, watching the sudden interest develop from his adjoining property that winter, came by Adrienne's fence line again, considerably more curious than skeptical this time. "Never thought I'd see winemakers fighting over 4 acres nobody wanted 18 months ago," he said. Adrienne told him, honestly, that she hadn't been entirely certain herself, only confident enough in what she knew about soil and fruit and fire to think the ground deserved a real chance before anyone wrote it off completely. By the following harvest, Adrian had structured formal, limited fruit contracts with 2 of the 3 interested winemakers, deliberately keeping volume modest to protect the recovering vine's long-term health rather than maximizing immediate income. A decision Dr. Cho, now a regular consultant on the property, described as exactly the kind of patient, quality-focused approach that separated a genuinely exceptional small vineyard from one simply chasing a moment's attention. Bettina Alvarez, the former colleague who'd told Adrian over the phone that she was letting grief cloud her judgment, flew out from Chicago that following autumn specifically to taste one of Marisol's finished wines made from Adrienne's fruit. Standing in Adrienne's restored, healthy rose afterward with an expression of genuine, humbled surprise. "I was wrong," she said simply. Adrian didn't need her to say much more than that. Adrian never made much of what happened on that scorched hillside. When people asked how she'd known the burned ground was worth the risk, she usually gave some version of the same answer. She hadn't known, not with the certainty a finished, celebrated wine eventually provided. She'd simply recognized something in that first walkthrough that reminded her of soils she'd studied seriously years earlier, and she trusted 19 years of hard-won expertise enough to test the comparison properly rather than dismiss it the way everyone else around her had. There is a particular kind of value that survives disaster precisely because disaster changes the very thing that makes it valuable. Adrian Fournier hadn't set out to discover a new vineyard terroir or spark a competitive bidding war among winemakers. She'd simply refused to assume a burned hillside was worthless before she'd actually tested what the fire had left behind. And in bringing her full, hard-earned expertise to that quiet, unglamorous testing, she found something considerably more valuable growing in the ash than anyone else had thought to look for.